Enrich Sahan from Doughnut Economics has been on my radar for a long time. In February 2023, the Financial Times wrote an article entitled "Struggle for the Soul of the B Corp Movement." This article, among other things, detailed some of the controversy surrounding Nespresso's certification as a B Corp in 2022. Erinch was quoted several times in that article with some respectful but strong critiques of the decision to allow Nespresso to certify as a B Corp. Erinch also had a number of structural critiques of the B Corp movement more broadly. And at the time, I was thinking, who the heck is this guy? And why is someone from Doughnut Economics saying these things about the B Corp movement? Well, this is exactly the type of conversation that Emmy and I created this podcast to have. Engaging with contrarian voices outside and inside of the B Corp community in a thoughtful, transparent, public, and constructive manner is desperately needed. You may be surprised to hear that Erinch describes his relationship to the B Corp movement as one of friendship and admiration. And he very graciously agreed to come on the show to give us an overview of Doughnut Economics, a background of his involvement with the B Corp community, and to go into more detail about his concerns and critiques about the direction of the B Corp movement. So one last thing before we jump in. We referenced something called the two loops model a few times midway through this episode. The two loops model was created by Margaret Wheatley and Deborah Fries from the Berkana Institute, and we have adapted it for our work at Lift Economy. We did our best to describe what the model looks like during the interview, but if you want to see a picture of the model and what we were talking about, please check out the show notes for this episode at lifteconomy.com/beyond. Without further ado, please enjoy the show.
Welcome to Beyond the B, an ongoing dialogue about the past, present, and future of the B Corp movement. Co-hosts Emmy Allison and Ryan Honeyman facilitate an open and honest conversation about the B Corp movement, advise companies on how to increase their impact, and provide a deep dive into the new B Corp standards that are shaping our community. Our guest today is Erinch Sahan. Erinch is the business and enterprise lead at Doughnut Economics Action Lab. His work focuses on transforming the deep design of businesses to enable them to pursue regenerative and distributed strategies. Working with 22 partner organizations and over 300 businesses, he has led Deal's work to create the Doughnut Design for Business tool, which enables businesses to engage with the concepts of Doughnut Economics. Erinch has been in leadership roles across business, NGOs, and government. He was the chief executive of the World Fair Trade Organization and spent 7 years at Oxfam leading campaign initiatives and founded Oxfam's Future of Business initiative. Erinch has also worked at Procter & Gamble as a market strategy manager, established a furniture business, and worked for Australia's aid program. Erinch, welcome to the show.
Wonderful to be with you.
Could you tell us a little bit about your background? How did you first get involved with the work that you're doing today?
Yeah, I mean, my background, Emmy, has basically been to inquire around the role of business for about the last 20 years. I grew up in a working class migrant family in Australia. I remember growing up in the 90s where it felt like the battle of ideas had ended. Global capitalism had won, and I really wanted to join the winning side. I wanted to join the global corporate world. So I ended up working at Procter & Gamble. I was a corporate lawyer for a while through the early 2000s and eventually ended up asking question after question about what is it in this enterprise that's holding back the kind of ideas and actions that we need from the world. That took me away from the world of business for a while. I went into the aid sector. As you mentioned, I was in the Australian government in Indonesia and then Oxfam for 7 years and then eventually ended up as the CEO of the World Fair Trade Organization. But along the way, I'd become friends with Kate Rayworth, my colleague and neighbor here in Oxford. We were working at Oxfam together when she came up with the concept of the donut and wrote the book on Doughnut Economics. So I'd been in conversation with her for a number of years around what does this all mean for business and having those deeper existential discussions along the way from the very inception of the idea of the donut through all the way beyond the publication of the book. And at one point, an opportunity came up to work with her more directly to define that, to roll out the work around applying the donut to the world of business. And that's where I am today.
So cool. It's been a really interesting journey for sure. Thanks so much for sharing. And for folks who don't know, what is Doughnut Economics?
Doughnut Economics starts with the premise of the donut itself. And the donut is basically about saying, look, we've got two critical boundaries that we must not transgress. We cannot overshoot the ecological boundaries, which are the 9 planetary boundaries that Earth system scientists have told us we can't transgress. So think about this as the outer concentric circle. At the same time, we cannot shrink our economy to a point where we are no longer providing the essentials of life. So we've got this inner concentric circle of the social foundation, and this comes from the social SDGs. And it's between these two concentric circles that lays a green space that is the fair and just economy that we need. It's the economy where we're neither in overshoot of the planet's boundaries nor falling short on life's essentials. And my friend and colleague Kate Rayworth came up with this concept, building on the work of Earth system scientists to provide this conceptual framework, and then wrote the book Doughnut Economics, 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist. That book's become a bestseller and describes ways and entry points into making sure that we're able to get into the donut, and puts in place very critical concepts like becoming regenerative by design and becoming distributive by design within the economy, becoming agnostic to growth, thinking in systems, bringing together the ideas and concepts from across the world of systems change and new economic thinking to propose a new way for all of us to thrive in the 21st century.
I'm a huge fan of donuts, both the pastry kind and also the economics kind. I just appreciate that it's such a simple model, but also is a very powerful framework to view our economies through.
And Emmy, I think at the heart of it, it's technically, I think, quite a robust model because it brings into a singular frame the social and ecological goals that we must pursue. But it reminds us that this is the goal. The goal isn't the accumulation of financial capital. The goal isn't other financial metrics or anything else that currently drives our economic system. This is the goal. This is where we need to get to if we want to live in a safe and just world. And that completely turns on its head, I think, the centerpiece of our current economic order, where all of life is in service to finance. And I think the biggest thing I take away from it is that actually finance needs to be in service to life, both human life and ecological, broader planetary life.
Yeah.
Awesome. One of the reasons we're excited, Erinch, to have you on the podcast is so for folks who don't know, we did interview Kate Rayworth on the podcast, our other podcast, Next Economy Now, when Doughnut Economics first came out. I'm trying to think, of that like 2016, or do you know roughly when that book?
Yeah, it's about 7 years ago now.
Yeah. So if folks are interested, check that out. And also, Erinch has been a good person who's nudged and pushed folks in the B Corp community to think a little more critically about, what we're sort of talking about and what we're prescribing as like the answer to many things. And I think Erinch has written a few articles, and he's both a fan of and has been critical of the B Corp movement in, I think, helpful ways. And this podcast, the goal of this is to really explore some of those uncomfortable questions with a goal of making, the B Corp movement better and more accountable, higher impact. And I'm curious, Erinch, what has been generally, for folks who maybe don't know some of your past writing, and what's sort of been your general perception of the B Corp movement to date?
Yeah, overall, it's been one of friendship, of admiration for what the B Corp movement has been able to achieve in terms of the narrative shift in what business is and can be, in terms of building enthusiasm for deeper change, in terms of helping create very tangible ways in which businesses and business leaders can understand their impacts, can consider them in far deeper ways in their decision making. And very importantly, what the bits I've been particularly impressed with, the bits of the B Corp movement that are really pushing beyond just the rolling out of the certification as the solution, the bits that are pushing for regulatory change, for new changes in corporate governance, for other kind of lobbying and enthusiasm to promote businesses, whether or not they are B Corp certified, that might align with the vision of the B Corp movement. So for me, that part of it has been a centerpiece. At the same time, I've seen a very diverse and broad movement emerge in this space. One that has gone from initially being much more about creating that community of practice, about creating ways especially from a more B2B side and a much less B2C side, a way of demonstrating businesses are understanding and able to pursue broader issues than just their financial bottom line. And I think in that diversity, there's been some things that I've witnessed that also need a bit of debate. There's been a lot of overclaiming, I think, in parts of it. There's been bits of it that are much more about seeing the certification itself as the solution without sort of recognizing the very inherent pitfalls of all certifications, but definitely the B Corp one as well. And also ones that are a little bit protective and tribalistic, I think, about the community. So some of the things I've said, I've in sort of daring to question some of it, actually, I've had some pretty heavy-handed sort of responses back as well.
Oh.
Yeah,
From people who earn a living, I think, off rolling out the clarity of the B Corp message, the purity of what's being marketed. And I can see that sort of those voices threaten potentially some of the livelihoods of individuals who built a life and a career around hopeful exponential growth of B Corp certification. And I think all of that means that it sort of made me feel like I've got a responsibility, because I don't have an economic interest in this at all. Either way, I don't work for any certification. I don't, have any particular reason to be critical or positive about any kind of certification. But at the same time, it felt like this is needed. And increasingly, I've been encouraged by people like you two who see the value of that.
Would you say that your critiques kind of came to a head? I know that you'd written some articles, and there was a Financial Times article about struggle for the soul of the B Corp movement. And you had written an article for Pioneer Post around definitely Nespresso had sort of been like a big red flag, I think, for you. Was there also maybe previous to that, were there things that you had that were sort of on your mind about, hey, that we should talk about this stuff? Or was it more that like that Nespresso really pushed it, like, hey, I got to start saying something?
No, I think I've been engaging with B Corp for a very long time. I was working at Oxfam at the time when B Labs UK was being set up by, I think, the now chair of B Labs Global, Katie Hill, who's a friend and someone I've engaged with for over a decade about these issues in very positive, very open ways. I can't imagine a better person, to be honest, to be chair of any global institution than Katie. And so I've always had those interactions, but I've also always sort of viewed when I'd go to like an event in Amsterdam, 7-8 years ago, or some kind of a gathering of the B Corp community, I'd see this diversity of enterprises that on the one hand were truly set up to be people and planet first, and ones that were set up to be profit primacy businesses that wanted to, while being profit primacy, have a better impact in areas that were aligned with their profit motive as being the centrality of their design. And I'd see that diversity, and I'd always feel like, well, we need to communicate that, because if there's a false equivalence between these very different kinds of enterprises, then actually we've got an issue. And the other thing that I've noticed over the years is the way that the topic of the business case comes up in the B Corp community. Sometimes there's a really strong enthusiasm to say, hey, this is how you make even more money. You make even more money by being a purpose-led business. It'll pay off in the long run. You'll get higher returns to capital. You'll get higher dividends. And then other bits of it that are quite actively saying, well, there are trade-offs in this, and I'm navigating these trade-offs in favor of people and planet. And I'm kind of being told that, well, that's a bit naive, because actually the really good ones make even more money by doing the right thing. And the reason this sort of felt a little bit like an issue that I'd noticed, a tension I'd noticed that people wouldn't debate very openly, and there'd be very well-rehearsed ways, I think, of closing down this debate, was that if we're arguing that actually in the long run you make more money by doing this, we don't need to change anything in the economic system. We already have a neoliberal economic system that diverts capital and channels capital to things that have the highest net present value in terms of return to capital. Like that, we just need to get more efficient at being in a neoliberal world order. And if that's truly what we think, then we're arguing against change, and we're undermining institutions and ideas and models that are saying, hey, this can't be the primary goal. We've got to wrestle back some control over the economy that has been sort of monopolized by financial markets, monopolized by financial capital. And it felt important to make that a more sort of open discussion about what is this? What is the vision of B Corp? Is it a vision where look, we're going to show how we make more money. Like I think it was B Labs UK that came out with the report more recently of, does purpose pay dividends? And I think the implication is yes. And there are corners of the economy where a smaller group of affluent consumers might reward some brands handsomely for being purposeful. But I know from my own teaching, and I've been teaching for over 10 years at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, through the students I've engaged with, it's becoming harder and harder. And the next levels of transformation we need in the business world, the business case is weaker than it was for the things we tried first off the bat. And I feel like we're doing a disservice to the complexity of the challenge that now faces us if we're arguing, actually, you're going to make more money. We don't need to change anything in relation to the relationship between finance and business. We just need to get more efficient and get more data in there and understand the impacts more effectively. And when I've witnessed that side of the B Corp movement, I feel like this feels like it's holding back change. When I've seen that ramp down, I felt like these are incredible allies that have done amazing things.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I get to talk to a lot of different kinds of people and a lot of different kinds of businesses. And I get to talk to them about why they want to be B Corp certified. And it is surprising the amount of folks who say that they're doing this because it's the right thing to do. It's disappointing when folks are like, we're trying to differentiate ourselves and what's the business case and that type of thing. It makes sense at the end of the day. It's such an investment. But I think one of the benefits of being at Lift Economy is we get a lot more of those folks who are like, this is the right thing to do, which is really cool. I think it's also interesting at Lift Economy, we talk often about the two loops model, the idea that we are transitioning. We're sort of like in transition to the next economy. We have midwifery, and then we're having the next economy loop. And the donut sort of reminds me of that model in a lot of ways. We talk often about how capitalism very much the economy is a tool to meet our needs. And I suppose that tool doesn't necessarily have to be governed by capitalism. So we talk often about, does capitalism actually make sense to be able to meet the needs of all of the creatures and the life on this planet? With that being said, do you think capitalism is irredeemable? Do you think that B Corps are protecting or even enabling a fundamentally flawed system? Or do you think that there's a version of capitalism that does sort of meet everyone's needs?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And of course, I don't have all the clarity of answers to all of that. I mean, firstly, we try to stay away, as Doughnut Economics Action Lab, we try to stay away from debates over some of the 20th century isms, mostly because how we define it varies so broadly that we end up speaking across purposes. Like what people mean by capitalism, for some it's a market economy where there's a for some it's just property rights, for others it's like this hyper financialized version of what we currently have, and there are many other ways people define it. So putting aside these definitional aspects of it, I think what we've witnessed in the last 30 or 40 years of the current economic system we've inherited is a complete liberalization of financial markets so that finance can flow in and out of companies and economies in very quick and very powerful ways. And increasingly, economies and businesses are chasing access to finance and are trying not to disappoint international finance, and as a result are in service to financial capital. And I think being in service to financial capital is like the key thing that I think we need to reverse engineer out of. We need to find a way to back out of this situation we found ourselves in, where amazing entrepreneurs are going to potential venture capital investors and realizing that they need to give control away if they're able to get the access to finance they need, or businesses that need to expand that have been around for generations are realizing they need to completely dilute their control over the business, or they need to demonstrate that they're willing to make sacrifices that will prioritize dividends, prioritize the share price at every turn. And that's the bit that I think a lot of us, including I'd say the majority of people that are active and engaged in the B Corp community, people in the social solidarity economy, people in the cooperative movement, people in the social enterprise movement, the emerging steward ownership movement, I think, and much, much more post-growth entrepreneurship. There are so many overlapping models, ideas, communities, movements out there. But that's what I see as what binds us, is that when we see a situation where private equity is saying, well, we've bought this thing out, we're going to strip down costs, we're going to improve the balance sheet and the profit and loss, and we're going to sell this off the highest possible profit in a couple of years. We're like, well, that's not the version of business that we're trying to promote. I think there's almost an unwritten agreement actually between all of these different ideas and models that it's about prioritizing something other than financial capital. And therefore, a lot of my critique, a lot of my input has been, let's get to the heart of that. Let's find ways to out that. We're not saying anyone's evil or good, and it might not be a very easy to measure thing, but let's make that the key bit that's driving the narrative forward, because then we're going to design the kind of enterprises we need for the current challenges we face, rather than kind of bury our head in the sand and think we're going to get there while giving away the control of businesses to financial markets.
Yeah. And as someone who my role at B Lab was to help companies understand the scope of their certification after they had been acquired or if they had merged with another company. And it was a little bit alarming to see the rate at which private equity moves and the way that businesses sort of like swallow up other businesses and are just sort of like gaining more power and influence with every sort of acquisition. So you're speaking a lot of truth here. And also you have said in the past that unless B Corp starts to focus on the deep design of business and what you're saying now, how companies are owned, who's represented on their board, where their profits go, it risks falling short of those marketing claims that you are referring to earlier here. Could you say more about the deep design of business?
Sure. I mean, and of course, there is a lot in the B impact assessment framework that does look at elements of deep design. So it's not like I think anyone that's involved deeply in the B Corp community is going to just be going, but we do this. This is who we are. This is what we, and I don't disagree. It's in there. A lot of it is in there. But you don't have to redesign your business in a fundamentally different way that wrestles meaningfully power back away from financial capital to give to some other stakeholders and considerations, and sort of to introduce you to the idea of enterprise design. It's essentially the 5 layers of design that the wonderful author and thought leader Marjorie Kelly has put forward. She's at the Democracy Collaborative, has written amazing books over the years, including most recently Wealth Supremacy, that looks at the power and the prevalence of financial capital. But she says there are 5 layers of design. There's a purpose of the business. Why does it exist? What does it sell? What does it do? Does it even need to be here? The second are the networks of the business. So the relationships with different kinds of stakeholders. What is it structurally in those relationships? And how are they decommodified? So you're not just in a relationship for getting to the lowest possible costs at the highest possible quality.
Right.
The third is the governance of the business. So essentially the decisions of, the way decisions are made, the power relationships within the company, who sits on the board, who's represented, and transparency requirements, etc. The fourth is the ownership model of the business. What does ownership demand? What does it expect? What does it enable? What does it prevent business leaders from being able to do? And the fifth is finance. So again, what are the expectations and demands of finance? And of course, these are all incredibly interlinked, because if you think about ownership, well, particular kinds of ownerships are going to demand particular kind of financial parameters. So you're hitting finance and ownership, and probably demand a particular kind of governance model so that you've got certain kind of control, whether it's private equity or publicly listed companies or venture capital. There's going to be an element that actually comes through and designs a company away often from the core of what the B Corp movement is calling for. And as a result, what I've been pushing on is, let's focus on the elements of the design of the company where we're getting to the relationship of power and priority between financial capital and all the other stakeholders. Because essentially, the economy does a great job of prioritizing financial capital. And if we're going to say, look, it's the purpose of the company is something broader, then power is a zero-sum game. If you're going to say some other stakeholders have power and priority, ecological set stakeholders, social people, communities, etc., then some power needs to be wrestled back away from financial capital, right? Like whether it's board seats, whether it's some sort of a limitation on what can be extracted, whether it's some sort of limitation on how companies can be sold off and exits can be facilitated, whatever it might be. And the kind of ideas I've thrown out there are just the sorts of things I've seen sort of emerge in the innovation around how companies are designed. And this does have a trade-off. This does mean your cost of capital might be higher as a result. And it does hit up against a very inconvenient strategic question of, well, by doing this, are we scaring off the billions and maybe trillions in financial markets that we want to see come into purpose-led enterprises? And I absolutely recognize the tension of that and the complexity of that. But I've concluded over the years that I've done this kind of work that it matters that we don't relinquish this question over to just the answer being, well, we must accept the power of financial markets. This is not something that we toy with. We do what's possible within those parameters. I feel like if we give into that viewpoint, then all we're going to do is have old wine in new bottles. We're going to have the old economy existing with some nice innovations on the margins, but at its the hyper growth of inequality and ecological destruction is going to progress.
I love this because in our team at Lift Economy, we talk about the next economy. It's sort of like the way that we describe, I think, what you're pointing to around deep design of business and where we need to get to. And honestly, our team at Lyft, when I first joined, so a quick background. So I came into sustainability consulting and found out about B Corps in maybe 2012 and was like, this is the best thing ever. And sort of was 110% all in and thought it was like the highest you could go, really. Like that's where my mindset was. Like, this is the apotheosis of impact, is like B Corp. And then I met my current business partners and they're like, well, what about cooperatives? And like, what about the problems with the venture model and how it forces companies to scale and go public or have an exit? And what about, sort of indigenous land back, or some of the things that like are not necessarily on the sort of standard B Corp radar. And so they got me sort of thinking, okay, so there's the sort of B Corp movement, and then we also need to like push this leading edge of the B Corp movement and really sort of look at what I think you're pointing to, which is the deep design component. It's not just, hey, do we have a community service policy and do we donate 1% of profits to charity, which are all good. So it's not like we're saying don't do that thing. It's just like what Marjorie Kelly is pointing to and what you're pointing to is we need to really look at fundamentally the design of the business itself. And I think in B Lab parlance, it would be impact business models, right? Within the B Impact assessment, it's these things like, is the purpose of your business to generate, you might say at Grayston Bakery or something, it's like we bake brownies, but the real point of the business is to like provide employment opportunities for folks who don't traditionally have employment opportunities and training. But there are also many B Corps, I think, that can piece together enough community service policies and we purchase renewable energy, but the fundamental, like what they do on a day-to-day is not necessarily creating that next economy or that sort of like deep design. Is that sort of your sense as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a story comes to mind of a business in India called Selco, which is a really interesting renewable energy company. I think its revenue is about 15 million or so a year at the moment in euros. So it's not, it's not minor, it's not massive. But it was really interesting when I got to know the story of Selco, because I realized that when they were set up, there was a shock to the solar panel industry. There was a huge amount of demand suddenly, and the cost of small-scale solar panels went through the roof. But their whole business model was around how do we get solar panels to economically marginalized parts of India, help local technicians to get skilled up, to look after them and roll this out. That was their business model. But at the time, their investors said, hey, wait a minute, it's becoming more expensive to run this business model. Let's just do large-scale solar. Now, large scale solar, it was quite and is quite profitable. Mainstream finance and mainstream business is rolling into it. It's great. That's a bit of the neoliberal economy that is moving. There's some significant investment in renewable energy. It needs to get faster and bigger. But if Selco didn't do it, someone else is going to do that. There's a business case already for it. And what Selco wanted to do was continue to pursue its business model, which is commercially viable but not profit maximizing. So it was able to pursue that only by redesigning its ownership model and bringing in values-aligned investors that were going to be far more patient, far more supportive of their business model and say, this is the reason we exist, even if other ecologically beneficial things that make us even more money come up. Our additionality, our point, our purpose is to do this. We're going to stick with this through thick and thin. I mean, if it's not viable anymore, that's a different story. If we're going to go bankrupt, then that's not good for anybody. But this is viable. This is commercially successful, even though the investors would make even greater return if we move to large scale solar, which wouldn't reach the people that don't have access to energy. So to be able to make decisions like that, you do need a different kind of enterprise design. And those two are very different sorts of solutions. And I think it brings up the key question for the B Corp community is it in service of the bit of the economy that can work without a change in the broader economic system, the large scale solar version of this business model? Or is it in service of those individuals, entrepreneurs, business leaders that are going to push on the boundaries even where it's not profit maximizing, but it's commercially viable and it provides true additionality? And that's a paradigm shift, because suddenly it's a different way of running a business. You're not running it based on growth. You're running it based on sufficiency, but social and ecological benefit. And if you're going to do that bit of it, then you've got to get into the kind of questions we're discussing. Here you go, well, wait a minute. When investors come in, what kind of power do they have? Do they have the ability to take over the board if you don't meet your financial goals? Do they have an ability to sell the business to even less values aligned people in order to get their exit, and then leave you, sort of sell you down to the wolves, as we've seen recently with some B Corps that have been sold to private equity, for instance? And Amy, you mentioned that. I get contacted by people in B Corp companies that are certified B Corp who sort of say, look, ultimately, because we're owned by private equity, we can't do the things we're writing down. We can't actually live our purpose. And I'm not saying it's impossible to do that within private equity or venture capital or share market listed. It's possible, but you can't be naive to the pressures of those ownership models and what it's going to demand of you and how it's going to limit your ability to fulfill your purpose and prioritize your purpose. And you're going to need to take some special measures to limit some of the power that financial capital has in that kind of a setup. And I don't have all the answers. This is a complex, new, but also exciting area of innovation in the way we design companies. And actually, a lot of the innovations happening from companies that are in the B Corp community. It's, Tony Chocolonely saying, hey, let's create guardianship shares that have got special rights, and let's put a true mission lock into this. It's examples like Patagonia saying, oh, let's build on the steward ownership model, and let's separate money and power in ownership in share classes. So those that have voting shares don't have the economic incentive to drive up profits and vice versa. A lot of it's coming from different parts, but even Danone, really interesting models in Bangladesh where profit reinvestment allows the social purpose to be pursued through the Grameen Danone Food Company, or examples even within, other parts of much larger and smaller B Corps that are doing the same thing. So a lot of it's happening in there, and this stuff matters a lot. So when we start to wash that out and create a false equivalence between businesses doing that and businesses that are unwilling and unable to do that, and we don't draw that distinction, then we start to undermine the very change, I think, that all of us are here to drive.
I love all this. And Amy had mentioned our two loops. And so what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to share this with you, even though we're on a podcast, and we can talk about it, and I'll try to describe it to people who are listening. So what I'm describing is the two loops model that Emmy mentioned, but we got this from Margaret Wheatley and Deborah Fries at the Berkana Institute. But for folks who are listening, if you imagine a circle, and then you move the bottom half, you cut the circle horizontally, and in the bottom, you move it to the right, and the top, you move it to the left. So it's kind of like it's like the circle doesn't meet anymore. We have the hospice curve on that left top circle, like sort of moving down. And so that represents like, how do we hospice out the old economy? So that's things like, how do we make, I remember the executive director of a environmental justice nonprofit I think it was the mid 2000s or something, went from, I think it was Sierra Club to Walmart. And he was like, we need to make Walmart have, at the time, it was compact fluorescent bulbs, because as much as the work I try to do in the Sierra Club, unless I change Walmart going from incandescent to compact fluorescent, like the amount of impact that Walmart can have is huge on compact fluorescent bulbs. And so we need to hospice out that old economy. And if you, on the right arrow or the sort of right loop going up, you're sort of like, how do we midwife in these new companies? So that would maybe be steward trusts, like the purpose trust model with like focused on indigenous economic values and, worker cooperatives, and sort of the models where these are the deep design changes we need to make in order to like get to the next economy. And I think the way that the Lyft team has squared this idea of how do we get Walmart to change its like CFL bulbs now to like LED, but also not lose track of the companies who are like permaculture, regenerative, work cooperative, who are really pushing the model, is to say we actually need two loops, and one is not necessarily more important than the other. So this top half is where more money is and more resources and more, it's where you can have Danone or a multinational make these incremental changes that have a big impact. And at the same time, we need the midwife side, but without Danone and Walmart making those changes, and we're only resourcing the midwife side, we're also not going to get to the next economy. And so I'm curious, Erinch, how does this sit with you? Does this jive with I'm just kind of curious for your general take.
I mean, spot on.
Yeah.
And I feel like trying to do both at the same time through same mechanism, same label, same identity, same movement concept is a disservice to those two very important functions. And that doesn't mean that the two can't interact and can't even be a part of parallel and connected journeys. But to throw the same product label on both, I think, is a problem, because it undermines the need for the midwifing. Yeah. And it reminds me of the core critique of Nespresso. I mean, you mentioned, Ryan, that in fact, a lot of this kind of started when I was behind the scenes saying lots of things to people and colleagues and others that I knew in and out of the B Corp movement. But I remember when Nespresso was certified, I probably was a bit unfiltered on LinkedIn, and I just sort of let loose a little bit. It's like, this makes me really angry, because we're creating an incredible false equivalence here. And for this to be an outcome that's celebrated, to celebrate what Nespresso is and does as being, a force for good, as being people and planet first, or whatever we want, whatever terminology we want to use. At the time, there was some more bold terminology used. I think it's sort of been watered down a little bit. That's such a big disservice. And I remember I looked up the financial reports of Nestle, and I knew their supply chain from years ago. I'd worked with Oxfam. I'd seen some of the farmers and their supply chains, and they're no worse than other multinationals, but they're cutthroat. They are cutthroat. And I knew that their supply chain policy was generally to say, we're not going to pay more. Like, no matter how much extra money we make, we'll do other things to make you more productive, to support our farmers, to improve quality of production or whatever. We'll do some of that stuff. And lots of companies are doing that. There's a lot of self-interest in doing that as well. And that's great and that's fine. But we're never going to pay more. And I remember looking up and going, but wait a minute, Nestle is paid for 30 years straight, roughly 30 years straight, increasing amounts of dividends to its shareholders. Nespresso is the highest margin part of their business. And at the end of every financial year, they think to themselves, right, our farmers are poor. They're the ones that grew the products that we're selling. Our shareholders have done really well. They've been getting increasing dividends for 30 years. What should we do with our profits? How should we divide this up? All of it should go to shareholders. That felt like, if that isn't a litmus test for purpose, to go, how do you handle the end of financial year when you've got a surplus and there's a clear social and ecological need that requires an investment of at least a part of that surplus, a meaningful part of that surplus, and you ignore that and you say all of it goes to shareholders, that's just how we're set up, that's how we're structured, then let's just not call that a force for good company. Let's call that something else. A company aspires to improve or something. But that's, and I know they're not the worst. They're not any worse than any other like major multinational in the way they treat farmers and suppliers, but you can't put them in the same bucket as Cafe Direct which puts all of its profits back into its supply chain to fight climate change, to share it with their farmers, gives board seats to their farmers, pays fair trade and above to their farmers, long-term commitments, does everything. The entire existence of that commercially successful enterprise is to benefit the farmers and act on climate. You can't say they're a force for good and so is Nespresso. And that really kind of got my goat, I guess.
Yeah. And I think your sort of experience in the supply chain at World Fair Trade Organization, and you mentioned Oxfam, gave you that sort of insight into like, wait, Nespresso, I actually know them. But I guess my question for you, this is a tension in the B Corp community. We almost mention on every podcast episode, it's sort of like who is in and who is out. Are we a big tent movement where anyone can be in, or are we a small sort of like hyper-focused on impact community? And I think the founders, it'd be interesting to know where B Lab is at today. I think they're probably in the big tent side, but the founders were really like, we want to be able to create a big enough tent where I don't think they are necessarily thinking of Nestle or Nespresso, but someone like Ben and Jerry's or someone can fit in and feel belonging next to someone like Cafe Direct. And I guess it's almost like, in a way, people have different ideas of what the B Corp movement should be. And in a way, sort of, I guess it's frustrating and challenging, but part of me is like, in a way, the B Corp community is sort of doing what it said it was going to do, is like create a big tent and like let those types of players in. And now we're like angry at them for it. And not, again, like I share a lot of the same concerns, but I'm just curious, how do you see that big tent versus small sort of impact community? How do you think?
I mean, I completely see the need for a big tent and for players that are doing the big tent role. And I think in playing that big tent, the messaging has to be really careful, and it seems almost harmless to go, let's put out front the most pioneering, the most progressive certified businesses as being sort of demonstrative of what this big tent stands for, but being incredibly unrepresentative of a lot of the members and those occupying the space in the big tent. I think that's a tension that I see. It's more about what the claims are. And I saw this happen in the fair trade movement too. And it's a really natural, I think, tension where at the beginning of a movement, you end up with the most committed, the most progressive, those where there isn't a business case, you're doing it anyway, you believe in this stuff. And over time, a credibility emerges, a profile emerges, and a value, a tangible commercial value emerges, whether it's like in staff retention and in acquisition, or with consumers or B2B partners or some social impact investors or whatever it might be, a value emerges. And you sort of fall into talking about the loudest, proudest parts of your community, and you use that value generated to bring in a broader set into the big tent. So even this, I think, is okay. You can say, okay, this is a very deliberate strategy. We're going to use the pioneers. We're going to use, a Cafe Direct, a Divine Chocolate, a Tony's Chocolonely, or whatever it is, to bring in broader players in this movement, to bring them along on this journey. But then it's incumbent upon you to open up those very uncomfortable conversations with those that you're bringing into the big tent. And that's why I've been saying, like, okay, well, make all of the companies that are declaring dividends at the end of the year go through a public process of saying, how did we prioritize paying dividends? What else did we consider investing into? Have we addressed all the social and ecological impacts we want to have? Have we made all the social and ecological transitions that require investment? If not, how are you justifying the provision of additional dividends or an exit for investors or whatever it might be, as opposed to investing into this? So I think if the goal is, let's have a big tent and let's also benefit from the profile of the pioneers who are going to be the loudest, disproportionately loudest and more sort of high profile members of this community, then let's make sure we use that leverage not just to bring into the big tent the big players, but to fundamentally transform things that get to the heart of their enterprise design, and not the cosmetic stuff around measuring impact or considering impact. I considered going for a run today, but I'm not feeling well and I didn't go for a run today. You can consider lots of things and not do them at the end of the day. So going beyond that and saying, okay, so all right, Nespresso, let's see, do you have a plan for the next 10 years to give a co-ownership stake to the farmers? Do you have a plan to give a board seat, maybe an observer board seat that might turn into a voting board seat? Do you have a plan to put X percentage of profits over time to a fund that enables you to pay prices that enable those farmers to earn enough to meet their basic needs, to escape poverty? Do you, things that are going to the heart of power and priority given to financial capital? If you're willing to open up those conversations, then my God, you're playing a very important, critical role. If by doing so, you're scaring people out of the big tent and you're not willing to scare people out of the big tent, then I think the big tent concept isn't really bringing people along, in a transformative way.
That makes a lot of sense.
One of the things that I think was shocking for me, but a good realization, was in this article that you were quoted in the Financial Times. You wrote, "We need to be very clear about what B Corp is and isn't. It's not social enterprise." And I was like, what? And you said, "It's not akin to cooperatives or employee ownership. It's not fundamentally changing the deep design of business, but it is helpful for assessing if a company is trying to do better on sustainability." And honestly, that was one of the first times I was like, of course, B Corps are social enterprise. It's like literally like we've met the standards of high social and environmental performance. And then I was like, what is the definition of social enterprise? And I think at least what I read online was it's more that the social, like the purpose itself of the company is for a social or environmental benefit. And I think that's maybe where you get B Corps who it's like, yeah, we're, selling a product, and the product itself may have some environmental attributes, like maybe it's like the packaging is recycled, or we pay our employees a fair wage or living wage, but the purpose of the business is not to address necessarily a social and environmental problem. Is that kind of what the critique you were pointing towards?
It is, and beyond that as well, to then go, well, how is a business structured to do that? Yeah. If you look at, for instance, the Social Enterprise World Forum, which has created a verification process called People and Planet First to look at the structures, just 5 questions to look at the structures of social enterprise. One of them is use of surplus. So you've got to reinvest the majority of any surplus towards a purpose. And that's a really interesting check. It feels arbitrary. Why 50%? Why 51%? Why not some other number? And any number will feel arbitrary. But to put a limit on the extraction of dividends is a bit of a litmus test to go, are you willing to put people and planet first while delivering some returns to your investors? When push comes to shove, what are your structural characteristics? Now, I wouldn't necessarily say every business has to be a social enterprise. Sometimes you need to be able to attract financial capital to have a viable business model. I've met people that have been in my workshops who are saying, look, if I don't get 500 million and the only place I can get the 500 million is through venture capital, I won't have a viable business because of the nature of the investment model I've got here, the nature of the business model I need to set up to just be viable. And that's fine. You can't set yourself up as a social enterprise from day one if those are your financial capital needs. But what I encourage people in that space to do is go plan for the future, plan for the exit, plan to open up the term sheet with venture capital and go, look, above this amount, we're going to do this, or above that amount, we're going to put in an extra board member, so that the upside is shared with your social purpose. It's not given away to the investors. And in a world of where private equity is at record return levels, stock markets are at record levels, financial markets are doing really well. I mean, on financial market indicators, the world is doing great, but we are overshooting the majority of our planet's boundaries. For the first time in a long time, poverty is rising again. Inequality is spiraling. It's wealth inequality in particular. In many countries and across countries, we've got a real issue here. Like, too much of financial capital is going to be in service of financial capital and to accumulate greater financial capital. So if we're saying we're going to prioritize something other than that, then we need to start bringing in mechanisms that are deliberately putting some kind of limitation on what finance can do. And that's why it's one of the 5 elements of social enterprise in the People and Planet First verification process. But to me, that often separates the wheat from the chaff. Are you willing to put a limit on the extraction of dividends for the investors? There are other elements like choosing legal structures and financing that protect and lock in the purpose long term. There's, of course, the purpose has to exist to solve a social and or environmental problem and other things. But yeah, I think limits on the power of financial capital have to be explicit. If they're not, they'll get washed over.
Yeah, this is so interesting because we're really like skirting around the benefit corporation status and the B Corp legal agreement. Theoretically, it's supposed to extend the purpose of the business to account for the needs of social and environmental stakeholders. But what you're saying is that there's a real lack. What we're missing here is the operationalizing of it, and sort of like, how do we translate those legal requirements into operational requirements? How are we building this into the business design? And you've mentioned some examples thus far, but I'm curious if there's like an overall strategy for going in and sort of really operationalizing the purpose and stakeholder governance.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, I don't necessarily have like a singular. What I've learned is that it's different for different industries. It's different for different sort of market contexts, and definitely different for different levels of maturity of a business. I've done now workshops with over 700 business leaders, getting them to put on the table what are the biggest, most transformative ideas that that you need to do, whether it's moving to circular product design or getting to a level where your factories and your supply chain sequester carbon, paying prices that enable, say, a double of a living wage in your supply chain. All of these amazing things that you might want to, even paying a fair share of tax rather than minimizing your tax bill. All these things that are going to hit up against often financial parameters. I get them to put them on the table. And initially people resist. They end up initially first putting on the table things that are possible, things that don't feel commercially naive or don't feel sort of financially way too challenging and unrealistic. When you sort of work through it and they do write them down, you then ask them, what is it in the design of your business or the likely design of your business, in the case of a startup, that's going to hold you back? And they will come up with different ideas. And then you ask, well, what is it in the design that could be redesigned? How could your ownership or your governance be redesigned? And what I found is that among those 700 plus businesses, there's no two that have come out with the same structure. Everything was very bespoke to their capital needs, their market context, the kind of personnel they had, the kind of ownership they had, and how they would design it with the founders' inputs. And so I wouldn't necessarily even have a verification. I'm not even necessarily saying if here are 5 things you can put into the B Corp standard that would fix everything. I don't think it would. I think it's more about feeding into the process of there being a need to redesign businesses and this being a journey for everybody. So making that the destination quite clear. The destination isn't whether you get certified or not. That's fine. That means you're beginning a journey. We can celebrate that, but that journey has to include a redesign process. And it might be a longer redesign process for some that are a particular part of their entrepreneurship journey, and it might be a different one for a company which is got quite sustainable revenues, sustainable margins, has really established itself, has got strong intellectual property or market position. It can now afford to do some slightly more advanced things like a Patagonia did or a Tony's Chocolonely did. So you would start to sort of redesign based on the stage you're at, and I think putting that on the table as a journey would help with the narrative shift that's now needed. Because I started this discussion saying the B Corp community has made a huge contribution to the narrative shift needed, that we need purpose-driven enterprises. That's absolutely right. Now what we need is to create purpose-driven enterprises. We need to take away some of the priority that's given to financial capital and give it to other stakeholders and design companies in a way that enables this to happen. And let's now create the diversity, the explosion of innovation that's needed on that journey, and recognize that no one's quite there. Everyone's going to keep redesigning, and we're moving towards that new economy in that sort of multitude of diversity that's emerging.
Thanks.
One thing that comes up for me around the deep design conversation, the like midwifing, as we might call it, the kind of very intentional forward-thinking companies, is you have a lot of entrepreneurs who feel stuck, like maybe they're 5 or 10 years in to a business and they're like, look, I just can't do it right now. Or you have multinationals who are like, oh my gosh, I'm a sustainability manager at Nestle or whatever, or at Danone. How do I take some of this, because we're already so far down the road? So what thoughts do you have for sort of this like existing crop of companies who were already built there are some options. I mean, like Patagonia, of course. It's always hard with Patagonia, right? Because, they were family owned, they were like one owner, and they're already so all about sustainability. And the profit margins from clothing, their stuff was pretty large. They just were very profitable. So I like the example. And it's sometimes other companies are like, Patagonia again, we can never be them. So how do we address this sort of like existing stock of businesses who maybe feel like we can't do some of the deep design work?
Yeah, I think that's the $1 million question, is how do we give people a sense of agency, that this doesn't feel like it's a insurmountable or unattainable kind of goal. And I agree with you that we might be getting to sort of Patagonia fatigue here with talking about it. I use it as an example because people have heard of it, so at least it doesn't feel obscure. But actually, there are dozens and dozens of steward-owned companies across Northern Europe that have got actually an even more advanced version of steward ownership structured into their ownership model, like Ecosia or Einhorn or Share Tribe in Finland. There's quite a few of these enterprises that have said, we're going to structure ourselves in a steward-owned way. But putting aside that sort of much more difficult, complete redesign of ownership, what I say to people who are in large companies that feel a bit stuck in their ownership model and their governance structure and their deep design, and can feel like they can do a few incremental things and a couple of cosmetic things and try to do better within the limits of where they are as a business. What I say is, firstly, this could be about a subsidiary. Look at what Danone did in Bangladesh. That is a fundamentally redesigned company. The Grameen Danone Food Company reinvests all of its profits now back into its mission to allow it to provide fortified, much more nutritious food to low-income households at the cheapest price possible. So whatever profits it makes as its sales go up gets back into making it more nutritious, back into making the price cheaper. The whole thing's engineered. After whatever investment model was put in initially, that's what it enables to do. That's a subsidiary. Danone's a publicly listed company, and it was able to pursue that. Others have done it in their supply chain. Kate Spade, for instance, New York-based company, in its supply chain, helped redesign some of its suppliers, including ones in Rwanda that became employee-owned through their model of empowering workers through that structure. They didn't need to restructure themselves at the highest level, but they helped this cause by redesigning it. Others, I sometimes also say, sometimes the most important things you can do is put on the table and try to leave on the table and have acknowledged the things you can't do. Because if all we do is celebrate the enthusiasm we have for the things we can do, we're going to be deluding ourselves into thinking that's sufficient. And it's not sufficient. We need to keep putting on the table saying, look, we're going to go with strategy B, but this would be strategy A. If we had the flexibility with margins or with CapEx rules internally to invest, this is what we would actually want to do. That would make a huge difference. It would be viable, but we realize that our rules, our financial parameters aren't going to allow that. So we're going to go with B. Just putting those conversations on the table I think are important. And I'm coming across more and more sustainability leaders that feel frustrated that they're unable to do that. I've been, for 3 years running, I've been part of the British Retail Consortium's program for leadership that helps explore these companies that increasingly have become private equity owned. There was a huge amount of family ownership and publicly listed companies among the retail sector, but especially in Britain, post-Brexit, there's been a huge conversion to private equity. It's been interesting having those conversations with business leaders in those companies. And some of the things that I sometimes hear from those individuals make it so clear that they've got amazing ideas coming up through the ranks, through their R&D team or the market insights team or the sustainability team or supply chain teams. And at some point, they don't get expressed because you're afraid that you're going to look naive, you're going to undermine the business savvy that you want to project, and it doesn't reach the top. So we've done some workshops sometimes where we've paired up very senior people with someone from the junior person from the R&D team, and watch the surprise from the C-suite executive as they hear an idea that never reached their table. And you start realizing this is important. Just keep putting on the table the ideas that are not commercially viable. And that changes the narrative. That helps innovation happen. You might be able to then do it within a subsidiary or some other arrangement, or find financially creative ways to do it. Another example from Danone, and it's my last example I'll give on this question, Ryan, is that I remember speaking to one of the senior people in their sustainability team that said that we're going to start looking at sustainability projects or begun looking at sustainability projects on a portfolio level, which means that the very high return ones subsidize the low return but high impact ones. And that's enabling stuff that otherwise wouldn't happen. Because a regular financial model might just say, look, everything just has to stand on its own merits. And if it overachieves, that's just extra surplus back to our bottom line, back to our dividends that we're going to pay off, or share buybacks, or whatever we're doing at the end of the financial year. Being able to then look at it at a portfolio level means that there's a level of generosity built into that. That's saying that, look, we're leaving some money on the table in order to achieve greater social and ecological impact. That feels quite transformative. That's a redesign of the business in a very meaningful way that changes the metrics of success for decision makers. So ideas like that can emerge from among businesses. Others like Natura and others have done this as a public listed company too, have done very interesting initiatives within their business, ones that sort of challenge the limits imposed by the design of the company. But it is a hard sell. It's much easier to just tell these people, let's just get better at meeting the financial parameters and accept the limits of the design of this company, rather than push up against them, out the fact that they are limiting us, and look for ways to redesign at least corners and elements of this business.
To play off the Danone, I love this Danone subsidiary. If someone were super pessimistic, like this is just humans trying to play, like someone who's just very skeptical, they might say, hey guys, our sustainability stuff, we can't just have organic milk in our yogurt. We need to like set up this subsidiary where it looks like we're doing all this cool stuff to really take the heat off our business. So you could always sort of like be just very skeptical and like glass half empty of like any corporate thing. So how do how do we know this isn't again, I don't know this, but like, how do we know this isn't Danone sort of having a way to take heat off their other not so great business practices?
I mean, we can't know, but what I noticed is it's really hard to find information about this Shakti brand in Bangladesh, about the deep design of the Shakti brand. You have to do quite a bit of digging. It didn't seem like, especially the English language sources that I found, promoted it that heavily or that clearly, what the structural design was. I think at the time it was launched, there was some stuff about it, but now I haven't found that much that plays up the very transformative nature of this design and really demonstrates how it's different to a philanthropic project. Having said that, the motives of it aside, I think what it does is it shifts the conversation. We're not talking about the win-win. We're not talking about the bit where you get even higher returns, purpose pays more dividends or whatever. Like that's not the narrative you're pushing now through the Danone example. You're now going, imagine what we could do if we can design businesses like this. And I think that's the imagination shift that I would love to see the B Corp movement sort of really put their shoulder into, with more boldness, more confidence, more courage, realizing it's going to be hard. There's going to get pushback from some of its allies in the financial markets, it's going to get pushback from some of the certified companies that clearly won't and can't go there in terms of the direction of travel, but make the anti-business case that, hey, the solutions we need of the world might not create maximum returns. You might just get sufficient returns, but that might be okay because we're enabling a transition that's urgent.
Yeah. And I think I love this sort of like strategy A, strategy B. It's probably going into other letters in the alphabet as well, and sort of continually and consistently presenting those as options and reminding folks like what we're doing is impactful, but what we could be doing is substantially more impactful. It very much reminds me of the saying, perfection is the enemy of progress. Progress is so important, and the way that companies can be most impactful often requires a very long-term vision. And so I really appreciate that. I hadn't quite thought of it before, and also sort of feeds into B Lab is like constantly trying to encourage companies to think about impact improvement all the time, not just at the recertification stage and when it's time to recertify. And so thinking about your next recert, the recert beyond, and how you can really be incorporating these fundamental shifts into the business model. I'm curious, you have been working with B Lab to essentially, challenge or encourage businesses to change this sort of deep design. In the next version of the standards, the evolution of the standards, version 7, have you seen some of those suggestions manifest in any way? Are they sort of Are you excited about the next set of standards at all?
I'm excited about some of them. I don't know I don't know what people are doing with all the input that's been gathered. I don't know really who the ultimate decision maker. Like, it's a little bit of a black box as well. Like, there are people appointed who seem like they're experts and impressive people. It's not a democratic organization. It's not necessarily like transparent beyond what it chooses to be transparent on, right? So it's got its limitations in trying to see through what's actually going on and where the different levers are pulling the certification. I am excited about the fact that there'll be mandatory requirements. I think that's a good thing. I'm excited that there was a very broad and seemingly open process of gathering input, including from people like me. I've seen very early iterations of those discussions that were exploring if and how those ideas can be incorporated. What I think would be a danger is to list the very transformative things I'm talking about, like a steward ownership model or a multi-stakeholder governance structure where different stakeholders are represented, or a co-ownership model with key stakeholders, or whatever it might be, or a profit reinvestment where majority is reinvested, for instance, into the purpose. If those are just options among much easier options, and then it makes it just look like, oh, here's a long list of good things, and you can choose the very easy to do good things or the very difficult to do good things, and there we go. We've now recognized everything, and that could potentially actually do more harm than good. I agree that B Lab and B Corp should be the Big 10. I don't necessarily encourage it to become a model that requires businesses to do all the kinds of things that we're talking about. It should require them to think about it, to justify why they're not doing it, to maybe have a long-term plan to edge closer to it. But we need a B Corp and a B Lab movement that is able to be a custodian of a bigger conversation, that doesn't overclaim, that doesn't necessarily say this is the umbrella body for all the different movements, that recognizes that this is a big ship and there's a sort of speedboats that are out front pushing the boundaries of what's possible, from post-growth entrepreneurship to platform co-ops to different models of mission-led employee ownership and whatever it might be. Recognize the value for them, is actively going, how do we keep moving the big tent in a way that gives greater credibility to what they're doing, and is actively saying, our communication, what we force companies to disclose, what we ask companies to begin doing, how can that be in service of the hospicing bit that Ryan showed earlier? How can the midwifery bit that Ryan showed earlier? How can the hospicing bit not just sort of bring along elements of the big tent to the extent that it can, but is actively saying, we're going to give greater credibility. We're going to use the power of this tent to give credibility to those bigger ideas that are beyond some of the elements of this big tent. I think that would be what I would love to see happen as a one step that I've proposed, just to be really also clear, to just propose one thing. I've just said, make companies at the end of the financial year disclose how they came up with the idea to pay their dividends, what they considered, what other issues required additional investment but didn't get that investment, what other stakeholders or goals required additional sharing of that surplus of profits but didn't. And that's okay. You're not structured to allow you to do that because of the financial model you've had to adopt, or the listing model, or the ownership structure you might be in. That's okay. We're not naming and shaming, but we're sort of moving the conversation towards that. I think that would be a helpful big tent approach. So yeah, my goal and the vision I would propose to those leading the B Corp movement is not to try to become sort of the pioneering edge of this broader movement of movements, but to bring over the big tent and make it be in service of the transformative change we seek.
That's so interesting, because I think transparency is so powerful. And I think that all these business decisions, these decisions that get made behind closed doors, is part of what's really fueling all this power and influence. And I do think that the next version of the standards, as you're saying, that a lot of them are mandated. But what's interesting is that there is more sort of transparency and disclosure required. We're sort of lifting the veil in a lot of ways, which is going to be really exciting. I would love to hear at least a discussion of how folks regard how they handle their surplus. We'll see how that manifests. But overall, I'm pretty excited about just a lot more transparency in general.
Erinch, I'm curious, as we move towards sort of wrapping One of the questions we like to ask our guests are, what do you need right now? And how can we and the listeners help support your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we all need right now is support for people that are doing the very difficult work where there isn't a business case to do this stuff, right? And all the entrepreneurs, the financiers, those in the ecosystem. So one is I guess, helping to make the case for the things that don't have a business case, for the things that don't achieve maximum returns, recognizing that, valuing that, celebrating that. I think that's helpful. The second is tell stories of innovation of enterprise design. Is there something interesting you did when you brought in investment into your business if you're a founder, where actually, I did a quirky thing by helping structure the governance in this way, or open up the term sheet to do this, or hey, I put nature on the board like a faith in nature is done, or things that do in very exciting ways redesign companies for that regenerative and socially distributive economy that we need. And thirdly, I think what we probably need is a little bit of a recognition of the different movements and ideas, and to just step a little bit back from over promoting any specific tribal identities that emerge here, and go, what a wonderful myriad of identities and movements and communities that have emerged in this space. Celebrate those. I think the B Corp community is now the highest profile. It's the one that attracts, I think, a lot of the attention of particularly the more mainstream parts of that economy, even though, for instance, the cooperative movement might be very large volumetrically, it's not attracting the kind of profile that B Corp is now. And to use that to give profile to these emerging ideas like, steward ownership, nature on the board, mission locks that are coming out, like find ways to kind of acknowledge some of the pioneering things that are emerging sometimes on the edges of the B Corp community and beyond in other parts. So support those other movements, actively promote them, like the People and Planet First verification I mentioned. Like lots of B Corps are now beginning to be both, like co-label. That's helpful. That's giving a sense of like directional travel that goes beyond the identity of a single tribal community here. So those are the three things I would ask for.
Love it. Yeah, you
I
actually
also love that.
Yeah, you actually introduced me to People and Planet First. I'd never heard of it until one of your talks you were mentioning it. And I was like, oh, what is this? I think B Corp people love like, oh, a new certification. I'll do it. People love to be like verified and like do things. Well, there's so much more to get into, and we're going to have you back on the podcast in the near future. Once the new draft standards are released, we can sort of nerd out and talk about how you're seeing it. I'd also love to talk about how we in the B Corp world, maybe a little more Doughnut, some of the business tools that you've created, like how B Corps can apply those. That'd be really interesting. Potentially go into that sort of interview. And so maybe, do you want to just drop like links, or where can folks learn more about your work, or follow you, and anything where folks can follow up?
Absolutely. I mean, the main place is at doughuteconomics.org. If you go to the themes part and drop down menu of themes and pick business and enterprise, that's all me. So I'm responsible for all the bits of doughuteconomics.org that is focused on the world of business and enterprise. And on LinkedIn as well. I mean, I'm pretty active in sharing things I see. But Ryan and Emmy, all I would say is that it's pretty lonely work sometimes, the kind of work we do. And I find most of my kindred spirits actually in the B Corp community. So I feel deeply connected with those pioneering, transformative, ambitious voices and actors across the B Corp community who are driving this change that we're all part of. I feel connected. I feel a part of that as well. So it's such a pleasure to be a part of that, to be listened to contribute, and also learn from. And I'll continue. I mean, I've done work with B Lab France, with B Lab Benelux, with B Labs Europe, B Labs UK. I'll continue to do that at every level, because actually the exciting conversations and innovations we need are happening within the B Corp community. And we need ways to supercharge that. This work is urgent. We don't have time to wait for shareholder capitalism to decide that it's going to transform itself. We need the new to emerge now.
Awesome. Amy, you want to say anything else before we close?
No, this has been such a joy. It's been so lovely to chat with you, to really dig in and really envision a world where our economy is meeting all of our needs and not extracting anything in the process. It's been such a true pleasure to chat with you today, Erinch. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Absolute pleasure, guys. I look forward to doing it again.
Beyond the Bee is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our past episodes, you can visit lifteconomy.com/beyond. Please take a moment to rate and review our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for listening.